Look at this sorry, sad selection of films. Can you blame me for taking this long to cover them? 12 movies. For reference, that's nearly double the amount from when I started this series in 2017. Superhero movies at this point in 2021 were showing no sign of the train slowing down as far as quantity is concerned. Candidly, I was partially putting off this video, as this was the point the superhero fatigue, as they say, was really starting to hit me. With the context of where we are now, and the bottom finally seemingly starting to fall out of this subgenre, I've been inspired to catch up so we can document the proper downfall, the difference between brand fatigue, superhero fatigue, or maybe just bad movie fatigue. However, my misery should translate into an entertaining video if you enjoy watching me tear awful movies apart. So let's go through every superhero movie from 2021 from worst to best. A lot of these are worst, a truly awful year for the most part. Spoiler warning, I will be ruining many story details when they come up, so you have been warned if you haven't seen these at this point for whatever reason. Use the timecodes to skip around if there are any entries you don't care about. Let's go. After the unfortunate success of the first Venom, we get another one. Venom. Let there be bullshit. The only slither of hope I had for this project was Andy Serkis being attached as director. With his familiarity with special effects and motion capture, I figured there'd be a chance it would be better. Much like his film Mowgli, however, it just really, really sucks.
I mean, the most important thing was, I suppose, making Venom feel real at all times.
Hello, bottom feeder.
Not to throw anyone under the bus who I follow on Letterboxd, but I was surprised to see swaths of people were being strangely kind to this movie. But that apathy doesn't work on me, bub.
All my secrets laid bare.
Yeah, I like the character, and I really like the movie, and, you know, that's not something that you can just assume will happen.
I'll give you my life.
What?
Story.
The film feels as if it were written backwards. The only point in its existence is to get to a scene where two Venoms fight each other, in a mess of goo, from which they can pluck exciting frames for trailers and marketing, just like the first movie. This film isn't interested in storytelling, consistency, or characters. This is another Sony schlockfest that had nothing on the line, had nothing to prove, and made a lot of already rich people even richer.
When you finally got to feel that the fans embraced your vision of this movie.
The first one, the first one wasn't my vision of the movie. But there were other powers at play in that aspect.
Tom Hardy's passion for this series is odd, with this film in particular standing out as he received his first story credit, supposedly spending months playing with concepts for a sequel, manifesting with a significantly more comedic tone than the first movie.
You suck! You suck!
Excuse me?
Yeah, wow.
Fully embracing that this is now a vaguely homosexual bromance that takes more inspiration from The Odd Couple than the violent and twisted origins of the Venom and Carnage characters.
You know, it was always going to be a kind of carnival, Day of the Damned, kind of, or Night of the Damned sort of festival, sort of with an LGBTQIA feel, and that really came from Kelly and Tom's, you know, the material and the script.
What in the world? All this crazy shit.
You have the titular parasitic gooey alien that forces its host to have a hankering for human brains up against a serial killer who gets his own venom. I somewhat understand the filtering when Spider-Man is the protagonist in the picture. It's a broader appeal, the lead character has morals and struggles that are more critical than the goo eating people's heads. The idea of an R-rated Spider-Man movie doesn't feel necessary to pull off a vaguely exciting interpretation of this character, but when you take the spider out and put another Venom in, you'd imagine this would be the chance to lean more into the comical, over-the-top violence that the concept promises. Sony did toy with this idea with the success of Joker, Deadpool, and Logan, but rejected it because it wouldn't as easily have been the 7th highest grossing film of 2021. That's depressing. At least try to hide the fact that you don't care about artistry or have any integrity outside of scamming customers into seeing an, ironically, parasitic leech of a company riding the coattails of a more successful franchise you happen to partially own the rights to because of Marvel nearly going bankrupt in 1999 and selling the film rights to Spider-Man for a measly $7 million, which they hold the rights to as long as they pump out a Morbius a year. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get deeper into this with the Morbius, Madame Web, and Kraven the Hunter movies in the future. Having Little Sims appear in a cameo to perform her song Venom, is about the cleverness level of all the jokes and dialogue in this movie. A song which delves into her personal struggles navigating the music industry, emphasizing credibility and introspection, and the unfortunate loss of creativity that comes with navigating pernicious, established corporations, combined with the baggage of various societal pressures. Wait, is this a genius 4D chess play by the filmmakers to hide some commentary? Or did they pick the song because it's called Venom? I'll let you decide.
Yes, Mama, I'm a bad, bad boy.
The Little Sims album that was released in the same year is incredible, by the way, check it out. The credits roll at 1 hour, 24 minutes. Thankfully, this is one of the shorter films on this list.
I didn't think that was a very good wig. I did think that the wig that I used in this one was going to be a little bit redder, but then it came out. On the other hand, it worked good. It's just a better wig, I thought. So
in a vacuum, this cast is ridiculous.
This some kind of joke to you, Eddie? Because I'm not laughing.
One of my favorite character actors, Stephen Graham, who sweeps you away with his performance in This Is England, Boiling Point, Boardwalk Empire, and countless other examples, is utterly wasted as Detective Mulligan, as is Woody Harrelson's Carnage. I don't know what he's channeling here, but he clearly doesn't give a shit, and I don't blame him.
Go on.
People love serial killers.
Naomi Harris plays Shriek, Harrelson's love interest who has the mutant ability to scream loud and deafen people. Conveniently, one of Venom's only weaknesses. They never stop to address the fact that mutants are a thing in the Venom universe, I guess. The film doesn't care, so why should you?
What? Nothing.
Whoa.
5-time Oscar-nominated Michelle Williams reprises her role as the iconic Anne, who has the best line read in the entire movie.
Venom.
Shout out to Reese Shearsmith, who randomly shows up as a priest in the church scene. Another wasted, talented British actor who has absolutely nothing to do.
Bad guy!
Tom Hardy and his cringy Venom voice obviously take up most of the screen time, with this exhaustive comedic dynamic. Hey, you know what? Make your dumb Venom comedy, but would it hurt if you wrote a joke or two?
Because I'm a real boy. And you're just an amoeba.
What is this? A lot of comedies use the genre as a crutch to ignore every other element that makes up a good film. The best comedies remember that they are also films. Films with mood, creative camera work, fun visual effects, innovative editing, provocative lighting and color usage, characters that make you feel something or have something to say. Oh, and actually being funny helps. Even when the film tries something more interesting, like the animated sequence attempting to mix up the exposition, they ruin it by shoving in an awkwardly framed and lit, obvious green screen of Hardy and Harrelson sitting at a table. It looks so cheap. $110 million cheap. Animated sequences in otherwise live-action films can be a great moment to flex your creativity and add some memorable personality. Jurassic Park, Hellboy 2, Deathly Hallows Part 1 all utilize the medium to cleverly fill in context and alleviate the droll nature of heavy dialogue dumps. It's frustrating as in a different universe you could imagine a dazzling picture that utilizes the concept of the characters to achieve some kind of effect. The extreme contrast of the black, white, and red could have been a striking through line for the look of the film, but that would be hard and take effort. The pace is so quick that it never gives you a moment to think, jangling those gooey keys as you wait in anticipation for the next weirdly sexual bit of tendril imagery. Watch me hack the internet with my goo tendrils, baby.
Got any of those internets?
Why is the hospital scene in Spider-Man 2 with Dr. Octopus scarier than anything in the movie with the brain-eating space goo and the serial killer? Well, that's mostly because Sam Raimi is amazing. The direction and cinematography here is lifeless and workmanlike, mass-produced and flat, with a poor utilization of blocking and visual space with way too many scenes shot awkwardly close, which creates an unintentional claustrophobic feeling in many scenes. There are only a small handful of action scenes for what is intended to be some kind of action sci-fi thriller, 2 prison escapes where all the fun parts are obscured, and the fight in the church at the end. The church fight is far superior to the equivalent battle in the first movie, with the nauseating Elon Musk goo mess next to a spaceship, but that's not exactly high praise. It's courageous and cool how Venom tries to
Where you going? Where you doing? This is much worse than I thought.
flee the final battle, and are those tears? Is Venom crying? This version of Venom sucks. He's a coward and by his own words, a loser. You can't fail if you don't try. And the success of these movies only motivates Sony to continue not trying. There is no excuse. There are decades of material to adapt at this point. They even half-assedly pluck a couple of elements from the famous Maximum Carnage storyline to rub salt into the wound. There's some good unintentional humor, I suppose, if you want to put it on and laugh at it. But these films pretty much guarantee we're going to have to wait an extremely long time for this character to be represented in cinema in any way that doesn't completely suck. Thunderforce. This was funny one. This was a real funny one. I didn't write anything for this because I did a trying to watch for this movie, which should be coming out shortly after this releases, or is available now for members on the YouTube channel. So check that out. These 2D animated DC projects always seem to have the exact same problems. A clearly limited budget, which as a result limits the animation quality and detail, juvenile writing shoved into a runtime that barely scratches an hour.
Where is he?
Alive. Someplace not even you can find.
I semi-recently revisited Batman: Mask of the Phantasm, and was reminded just how excellent the Bruce Timm-led animated stuff used to be. The Art Deco design and voice acting was top-notch, quite a contrast to the unfiltered baby cringe you'll find here.
That was incredibly stupid. You do not touch a man's parents.
There is nothing interesting or memorable going on. Right as I went to turn this one off with the 30-minute rule, this happened.
Heil Hitler.
Real-world history combined with something as campy and over-the-top as superheroes can be a charming concoction. Other times it can appear tonally confused or out of place. In quick succession, you jump from Superman and the Flash fighting Brainiac. The Flash catches a kryptonite bullet and is sent to a different dimension, World War II.
Nazis?
Where the Justice League equivalents, the Justice Society, are 1 minute destroying SS officers in France and evoking concentration camp imagery. Next, they're bumping into Atlanteans who are taking the opportunity to take over the surface world with Wormtongue, Cthulhu, a flying monster thing, and a giant crab. I wish this was as stupid and entertaining as it might sound.
Keep running. Follow my voice.
Superheroes are best suited to animation. The suspension of disbelief is more natural, the parallels with the source material speak for themselves, and most of these superhero movies wind up being so special effects heavy that they might as well be called animated projects anyway. You could even interpret comic books or graphic novels as extremely polished storyboards. Plenty of filmmakers use them like one. Unfortunately, no one cares about animation unless it's for babies or Japanese. Shows like Invincible in the West are doing their damnedest to change this perception, and there is the odd diamond in the rough, but for the most part this medium is trapped in an awkward catch-22 of limited potential. Investors don't believe in the medium outside of kids' content, so they won't produce big projects that could start a new trend, so the examples we do get are usually pretty mediocre or made for children, reinforcing the status quo. Even Invincible, which has the backbone of an awesome comic behind it, is marred by the nature of the medium. 2D animation is so expensive, time-consuming, and a difficult discipline to master, none of which are qualities that appeal to investors. This struggle is obviously compounded when you're a straight-to-DVD DC animated project barely anyone has seen or heard of. In fact, I'm amazed this division of movies continues to exist.
Well, that was anticlimactic.
The film is very short, rushed, and all over the place quality-wise, with an emphasis on set pieces and action like most other superhero projects, but without the grunt necessary to sell them. As far as line work and expression, it's slightly better than some of the other recent films of this ilk that I've seen, but it still suffers from a general lack of polish with plenty of rigid movements and facial expressions. Unless one of these looks particularly funny or interesting, I doubt I'll include these types of movies in the future videos in this series, because man, they are boring.
We can't complicate the timeline.
Oh, right. I've seen that movie.
It was around this time that Marvel got a bit too big for their britches, and especially seeing how much they made from garbage like Captain Marvel, it seems they took away all the wrong conclusions from the success of wedging it between the biggest event movies they've ever released. This is 2 hours I'll never get back. Well, technically 4 hours 32 minutes because I had to watch it twice for this video. It's not even like this is a particularly bad Marvel movie by any means. In fact, it's nowhere near the best or worst that this franchise has to offer. It's just kind of there. Obligatory. the most Marvel movie to ever Marvel. Obviously, with this release coming after the character's death in the main timeline, and within the movie taking place shortly after Civil War, and being stranded in virus season, the timing for this wasn't great, and it starts from a foundation of having to fight an uphill battle. It's not like Black Widow was a bad character, but aside from the fact that Scarlett Johansson is a bankable Hollywood star who gets butts in seats, and the higher-ups clearly sweating after realizing they hadn't had a woman protagonist until around 20 films deep, where the Wasp gets equal billing to Ant-Man. Black Widow is a good complementary supporting character, but really struggles to carry a full feature, especially when much more interesting superheroes like the Hulk or Scarlet Witch seem relegated to the background despite their greater potential. The angle here is trying to capitalize on the more serious espionage tone of something like Captain America the Winter Soldier, a fan favorite for good reason. With the inclusion of super serums and various name drops, it's clear they're channeling the thriller tone to remind you of it. However, in typical Marvel fashion, the oppressive restrictions of the framing hurt its overall tone, and various creative decisions leave this being a completely forgettable entry in this series. A strong cast do their best, aside from their horrible Russian accents, to add some texture to these thin characters.
One command, and a quarter of the planet will starve.
The chemistry and potential, though, is largely wasted, but some decent dynamics keep it from being a total loss. The idea of a Russian equivalent of Captain America is campy and hilarious to me, but to fully utilize this, you'd simply need Steve Rogers in the story in some form. Otherwise, this character of the Red Guardian is largely relegated to comic relief.
What?
A super soldier who has somehow been confined to a prison for decades, who only gets a small handful of scenes to show off the super part of his soldiering. This is the trap that having Black Widow as the lead character forces you into. Obviously, as the action hero protagonist, most set pieces and action scenes have to revolve around her playing a key role. But as far as I'm aware, she doesn't have superpowers or a super suit or anything supernatural going on, so she's limited to what a well-trained human could accomplish. I found it stupid in the original Avengers where Black Widow grabbed onto an alien spacecraft flying 200 miles an hour around New York. But you can only get so mad at moments like that in an ensemble team where you have a mixture of green giants and high-tech science fantasy that requires you to suspend your disbelief already. She was also a tiny slice of a pretty big pie. Here they want the best of both worlds with the tone. Let's have child trafficking and cringy Nirvana covers to remind us how serious this is for a Marvel movie, but let's also have mind-controlling red dust and action that relies on the Fast and the Furious level rules of what a character can go through before they get injured. This is important because in an action movie, the action obviously needs to have stakes and tension, otherwise what is the point? We already know that this character will survive because it was technically released as a prequel, but there isn't a single moment that doesn't undercut itself with typical Marvel humor or death-defying stunts of such insane scale that it stops being a serious espionage thriller and turns more into the roller coaster theatrics that have been a complaint with these movies for years now.
This is a much less cool way to die.
This would be less of a problem if it didn't insist on these comparisons, but with obvious nods to James Bond and Mission Impossible, it's hard to miss or not be reminded of how much better those films are, especially when you compare budgets and what was achieved with said budgets. $288 million spent for manufactured assembly line mediocrity, compared to the comparatively modest $180 million in 2018 for something like Mission Impossible Fallout. And even then that's disingenuous, with Fallout eventually costing around $250 million itself because of injuries. Injuries as a result of the kick-ass action that is a contender for the most impressive action scenes ever put on film. Something that elevates Tom Cruise as an action hero is his ability to act.
You're stepping over a line now. You're stepping over a line, you know you are.
Paired in tandem with the insane stunts that he commits himself to achieving in frame. He actually flies helicopters and jumps out of planes, rounding the action in a way that simply cannot be matched by David Harbour or Florence Pugh. The tension you achieve as a result of this is edge-of-your-seat stuff. In Black Widow, by contrast, this manifests in action scenes that have to be cut in a way to hide stuntmen, giving a more choppy, handheld, and restrictive flow to the hand-to-hand combat that makes up most of this movie. Or resort to CG cartoon people flying around in moments so over-the-top and schlocky that it's hard to care or be invested at all. Speaking of Mission Impossible Fallout, the same composer worked on both films for the score, which, by contrast, again, is night and day. The Black Widow score sounds like stock temp music with very little to communicate, except the obvious emotions you'd expect, whereas the same same composer brought a level of intensity that perfectly matched the impressive set pieces in the film that had a much stronger voice. Overall, a completely serviceable blockbuster with very little to say outside of the usual rollercoaster theatrics, underutilization of an excellent cast, and winding up being one of the more forgettable and obligatory Marvel entries to date. Perhaps if this had been released at some point shortly after Civil War, I'd be more positive on this, but given the context of when it came out and how tired the formula is, I will probably never think about this film again. Eternals is a giant, ambitious, boring mess. This is the first film in the MCU to fall flat on its face for reasons other than it just being another generic Marvel movie for the pile. This film is attempting so much, trying to cram so much content into one story, that there is simply no way to make this kind of narrative work without slicing, rearranging, reframing, or elongating its already bloated ideas. There's an immediate clash with the quiet, thoughtful, understated styles of Chloe Zhao, with the pulpy, over-the-top, bombastic spectacle of what draws people to the MCU in the first place. There's no doubt that after Endgame, Marvel needed to shift gears and attempt a different style or tone in order to refresh the direction of the universe and reinvigorate a formula that was already getting tired only a handful of phases in. Unfortunately, it seems like Kevin Feige and company took away a lot of the wrong lessons from the successes of ensemble films such as Guardians of the Galaxy and started veering into territory that more closely resembles the coldness of a Zack Snyder epic than something that fits into this universe. This film simultaneously tries to establish 10 new main characters, all of their backstories, their character dynamics and relationships, powers and abilities, the new universe rules and restrictions, a multi-layered existential villain that taps into deep metaphysical concepts about the very meaning of life and death, a more standard villain who absorbs powers, a love triangle, a location-hopping adventure, a timeline that traverses thousands of years of human history in a non-linear order, action scenes that utilize all of these details in a way that is tense and exciting for an audience to watch, reference its standing in the broader MCU, and establish future characters and setups to tease what's coming next. You would need an entire trilogy or 8-hour TV show to properly utilize and explore these concepts without it getting bogged down in the expected traps that this list obviously brings up. It doesn't help that the lead perspective character that is chosen to be the focus of the story is arguably the least interesting out of the 10. I don't really know much about her as a character aside from the fact that she's in a love triangle, works in the Natural History Museum, and can turn rocks into water. The character bloat effectively narrows them all down into being defined by nothing more but what their powers are. There's the one who can punch things hard. There's the one who can shoot energy from his fingertips. The one who can heal. The one who can run fast. The one who has a spear, and so on. Most of these powers are not particularly interesting in a vacuum, so the innate drama or conflict of their abilities is hardly even part of the character of the movie. Instead, getting lost in its lofty ideas about identity and meaning, ironically giving this movie a hollow and frank lack of identity or meaning. I was trying to think of a single example of a movie that establishes this many main characters without getting lost in itself, and all I could really think of was Lord of the Rings or maybe Magnolia. But Lord of the Rings is a trilogy, and B, fairly linear as far as how the story moves and delivers information. The Fellowship is a group of 9 characters, with most of the runtime of the first movie dedicated to the hows and whys that this group are even together in the first place. There are so many examples of overly ambitious movies who throw way too many characters into a limited runtime, and it's especially strange for Marvel to fall into this trap when originally they were the ones to meticulously and purposely avoid this pitfall by establishing necessary characters outside of the team-up movie. The Guardians of the Galaxy worked because you had the wacky James Gunn at the helm, who was already familiar with the over-the-top gonzo comedy filmmaking, which was a natural fit for the universe, but also kept things simple, relying on a central character and giving everyone around him just enough detail to flesh them out. Eternals removes most of the fun, most of the comedy, most of the action, most of the personality that got people into these types of films to begin with. I pulled up a picture of the full lineup of Eternals and tried to decide who was truly necessary to make something interesting out of this story, ultimately concluding, in my humble, correct opinion, that half of these could easily be removed to focus on the characters of note who actually have a dynamic that is innately interesting. Angelina Jolie's character probably would have made more sense to be the lead if they could have figured out some way of tying in her memory loss as a more natural excuse to dump exposition. It could have been much easier to follow the confusion through a character who's just as confused as the audience. My biggest complaint with Captain Marvel was that the invulnerable, overpowered heroes are much more interesting as villains villains, as it raises the stakes and makes the challenge for the heroes much more difficult to overcome, which Richard Madden's character kind of leans into. Alongside The Boys and Invincible, the evil Superman trope is kind of getting suitably explored, but it could have been a fun twist reveal if you actually cared about the Icarus character before the switch is revealed, and was one of the few times in the movie I actually felt like the conflict was veering into a place I found more compelling. Barry Keoghan actually had the best character hook to me. The mind control brought up some moral quandaries that worked well with the themes of control and manipulation, and had the best creative imagery associated with it. With more expansion, I felt like this character could have gone somewhere. Salma Hayek is more of the necessary wise elder oracle role who is useful to have around, and Brian Tyree Henry was basically the Iron Man tech guy who was the designer and had the incredibly corny Hiroshima scene where he lamented helping humans advance technology. Again, an idea that I could kind of see being expanded into something neat, but ultimately winds up being lost in the frantic rush to develop so many conflicting stories and characters. Ma Dong-seok is largely throwaway. His powers are pretty lame and repetitive in action scenes, with his best trait being the protective relationship he has with Angelina Jolie. Again, an idea that you could have some emotional resonance with, given the appropriate amount of development, but you're left with so little that his overall presence is minimal compared to how much is going on around him. Sprite is probably the most irritating character in the movie, cursed to be a forever child, leading to a bizarre dynamic where she's in love with Richard Madden but can't do anything about it because she's trapped in the body of a 12-year-old. Another concept that could have been expanded into something more complicated, which Invincible does actually do with the Monster Girl character, but Sprite's rushed betrayal arc gives you such whiplash, but it also leaves you wondering why she was even there to begin with. Lauren Ridloff can run fast and is deaf. That's about all you get there. Most of the Marvel humor you've come to expect is delivered through Kumail Nanjiani, who by the time he shows up in the movie feels strangely out of place with how typically Marvel he's written. His character feels like he's awkwardly placed to lighten the tone, then abandons the story when he's no longer needed for the drama. At first I assumed this was some kind of mislead so he could come back into the final fight for some kind of redemption arc. Instead he just leaves and doesn't come back until everything's wrapped up. He's supposed to hammer home this idea that the conflict of the Celestials, using life to power their worlds, seeds is more complicated than it might seem. But again, there simply isn't the real estate in the script available to explore these ideas without a handful of lines that wind up lost within the exposition dumps and other story beats. No scene in this goddamn movie is allowed to breathe. You jump around location and time so frequently that keeping track on a first watch is needlessly difficult. 1 second you're in 5000 BC Mesopotamia fighting worm monsters, then you're in modern day London. Oh, let's go back to 575 BC Babylon. Hang on, let's check on the 400 AD Gupta Empire. 1 minute later, you're in South Dakota. Let's see 1521 AD Tenochtitlan. Let's go back to South Dakota, except this time it was 6 days ago before the main timeline. You keeping up? Is this making sense? You've really got to pick your battles when establishing your epic, so the audience can grip onto something to keep them intrigued. Is it the characters? No. Is it the action? No. Is it the story? No. Is it the presentation? Not really, although that's definitely the most interesting aspect of this movie. The use of real locations did help some of Zhao's style escape through the Marvel machine, especially when scale is concerned or how various outdoor locations are established. However, once the animators take over the elaborate, fully CG fight scenes, it can be quite a clash. When all hell breaks loose in the final action sequence and Icarus is flying around Man of Steeling everyone, it breaks down into the typical fake-looking cartoon action we've seen 100 times before. It's so strange for clear visual inspiration such as The Revenant or Terrence Malick, juxtaposed against this loudmouth stupid action with squid monsters flailing around each other. Speaking of squid monsters, the Deviants are another underutilized element of this movie. They're monsters that have the power to steal the Eternals' powers, slowly evolving over the course of the movie until the leader takes the form of a humanoid, starts embodying the memories of everyone it's absorbed, and eventually swears to kill the Eternals for what they have done. Visually noisy designs that mostly exist to be punched and killed by the Eternals. There are so many details that I forgot are even part of this movie until you're randomly reminded they're still in play. Oh yeah, Jon Snow is in this. Oh yeah, I forgot he was still about. Wait, who is this guy again? What is happening? The rushed nature of everything leaves very little chemistry between actors, and the dialogue and overall plot suffer as a whole. It leaves the impact feeling void. There's so little emotion or effect to anything. It is kind of funny that they're somewhat forced to commit to their bad movies because of the way everything is intertwined, with Patton Oswalt letting slip that they're apparently going to move forward on a sequel, even despite its poor critical and commercial reception. We'll see about that. They still haven't even acknowledged the giant hand that's just protruding from the earth now, I guess. Watching Eternals again for this video really highlighted the endless amount of problems it has, and I can't say it was a very memorable or enjoyable experience. Huge miss for a studio at the very least will deliver something usually kind of watchable, but that runtime is as inexcusable as the misplaced ambition. For a film originally intended to release in 2017, warped by tragedy, duct taped together by a Marvel director, winning the first ever fan-voted cheer-worthy moment award at the 2022 Oscars for the Flash entering Speed Force scene, the 4:3 aspect ratio, the 4-hour runtime, there is so much drama and intrigue surrounding this movie that is difficult to talk about without the conversation getting lost down these various different avenues of comparison and fandom. To get it out of the way, there's no doubt in my mind that this film is vastly superior to the horrible mess that is the theatrical Whedon cut of the same movie. However, that's not to say that this self-indulgent passion project isn't indicative of an ongoing problem Snyder has brought to the screen time and time again with his interpretation of the DC universe. It's strange, normally I would be advocating for a single artist's vision and personality to be valued over a council of shareholders and homogenous overlords that try to reel back and stranglehold the very thing that can make filmmaking so personal and special to begin with, but the risk that comes with allowing auteur directors to do what they feel is right means that everything is kind of riding on them being able to deliver. It's an admirable and risky idea. I just wish it was a director other than Snyder that was given the keys to this absolute banger of a car that can take some corners with surprising finesse and grace, but by the time it reaches its destination, has multiple flat tires, a smashed windshield, and a musky trail of smoke left in its wake. The concept is not complicated. We need to assemble a team to beat the big bad guy, with the equivalent MacGuffins to the Infinity Stones, except shoved and established in one single movie.
I'm always stressed.
There's one team-up fight that goes badly because the group isn't working together, and then there's one fight that goes okay because they do work together. Hooray! And they also have the win button that is Superman. This was already a tired story back in 2017. Not to say that a Justice League movie plot needs to reinvent the wheel, but if the plot is unengaging and trite, other elements such as action or character need to jump in to fill the void. The insistence to get to this Justice League get-together so quickly means it suffers at a foundational level. Contrary to Marvel, who spent years establishing each relevant character in their own movie, which allowed them to get the origins and exposition out the way so you could get straight to the fun part, in the team-ups. Here, half of the runtime is spent explaining and establishing who the majority of the cast are. Aquaman, the Flash, Cyborg, and I guess Martian Manhunter for some reason are now on the scene. Aquaman is a hilarious addition. 10 years ago, back when I started this channel, I picked Aquaman as a recurring character to mock because it's just too easy. The overcompensation to try and make this inherently lame character into a hyper-masculine badass screams as clawing. I guess creative use of sea creatures and water was too dumb and cartoonish for Snyder to embrace, so he's largely relegated to egregious slow-mo shots that look more like beer adverts than exploring what a sea-based superhero could actually bring to the big screen. I don't know why this character needed to be included. When it really comes down to it, he offers very little as far as action dynamics for the big team-up fights. He can jump around like a grasshopper and is strong. We already have Wonder Woman and Superman. His inclusion seems mostly pointless, aside from the odd underwater scene that is inconsistent with the James Wan solo movie that came out after this was originally shot. And obviously Jason Momoa is a big box office pull. Controversy and casting aside, the Rick and Morty fan Flash is incredibly annoying and perhaps the biggest missed potential from the large cast of lead characters.
That feels like an oversimplification.
The Flash has the potential to be one of the most fun for set pieces and action spectacle, and that's not to say you don't get the odd hint of what this character could deliver, but every time it skirts the potential, you have an equal scene of fanboy Flash confusing the tone and weighing down the group dynamic. It's sad that an X-Men movie from 2014 still holds the crown for the best super speed character and scene. Dash is good too, actually. With clearer limitations and better dialogue, this character could shine, just not here.
What are your superpowers again?
I'm rich.
Batman has very little to do in this equation. He takes more of a Nick Fury role of assembling the team, but with the nature of how exaggerated and powerful everyone around him is largely relegated to background scenery or the guy who provides various vehicles to travel around in, or to make obnoxious jokes about how rich he is.
How did you get the house back from the bank?
I bought the bank.
Because he has literally nothing else to offer in this story. Wonder Woman is possibly the worst performance from the main cast, which is saying something, who unfortunately gets the brunt of exposition, which falls flat along with their equally flat delivery.
They came here once before. Long ago.
Cyborg is a Vision equivalent character, born from the technology of the Mother Box, with his arc mostly relating to his dynamic with his scientist father, who pointlessly sacrifices himself, similarly to Papa Kent in Man of Steel. The biggest problem I have with this character is mostly visual. He looks ridiculous and can do pretty much anything relating to technology. Again, the character and his rules are rushed over in order to get to the unearned team-up moments. His visually noisy design isn't easy on the eyes, with the only grounding factor being the slither of Ray Fisher's real face. He's more bearable when restricted to just a hoodie, and he's really the only character to get a decent level of characterization and change throughout the movie. The third arm he has randomly popping out is extremely weird though. Why'd they do that? Speaking of visually noisy, ugly designs, Steppenwolf, remember him? Got a reskin from 2017's Whedon League to now be covered in spikes and look like an unreleased Bionicle. He already kind of looked like a Bionicle, but now he looks even more like a Bionicle. And this time he has a motivation, instead of having no motivation. He's a standard lackey, goon type character. That word has been so ruined. Trying to prove himself to the Thanos equivalent Darkseid, supervillain. He does nothing but twirl his mustache, spit out platitudes, and die. Darkseid's ultimate evil plan boils down to gathering the mother boxes to synchronize the unity and find the location of the anti-life equation, which makes about as much sense as it sounds. He's even shown in a flashback to have already found the anti-life equation before, but I guess he forgot where it was. What? All of the Snyder villains have the exact same texture, and all of them feel like they're cut from the same cringy, stuffy, and overly serious cloth.
It's toxic. That's good.
Large swaths of the movie are dedicated to setup for various projects that never will see the light of day. Some teasers were initially shot to set up the standalone Ben Affleck Batman film that obviously never happened, alongside entire sequences shot in Zack Snyder's back garden that simultaneously feed into this ongoing future timeline that was first teased since Batman v Superman, but also give lip service to imply fan-favorite comic book moments like the death in the family. This epilogue is one of the most embarrassing endings for a film of this ilk I've ever seen, and that's not exaggerating. There's an extensive Vanity Fair article that details what this onslaught of shit was supposed to look like by the end of this 5-part trilogy, as Snyder puts it. The fact he was even able to get 3 of the 5 parts made is baffling enough, let alone what the plans were for the 2 following Justice League movies. Superman siring a new Batman with Lois Lane being just one of the crazy details. As far as what I liked about it, I will say the original score by Junkie XL is a highlight, I mean in a vacuum at least. The only superior music from the Whedon cut being the Flash theme. The score elevates a couple moments that otherwise might not work, such as when the Justice League decide to resurrect Superman. Outside of that though, the choice and implementation of music can often be scene destroying. There is so much unintentional humor and goofiness that is too often highlighted by the awkward use of "Oh my god, can you please shut up?" Despite how everything I said was largely scathing, with every big moment either being ridiculous or unearned, there is something weirdly likable about this Frankenstein's monster of a project. I'd watch it again, maybe, but it's not good.
Fuck the world.
Disney in 2021, desperate for content to pad out their fairly new streaming service while simultaneously trying to combat the brutal economic realities of a worldwide pandemic, released 4 feature films straight to their obvious doom. Even Pixar's widely enjoyed Luca is likely to have been a financial failure. It seems standard practice, when convenient for a megacorp, to hide or obscure useful statistics like budgets and box office. Simple ins and outs are much easier to hide now, with the emphasis on streaming completely changing the bar for what qualifies as a success. 10 billion minutes watched is a meaningless metric, and is only brought up because the word billion sounds big and impressive to shareholders. If it made money, they would brag about the money, instead of trying to hide the truth about the money. I bring up this diatribe because this reactive streaming world isn't without its losers. In fact, this new landscape has created a new type of loser. The type of loser that never existed. Disney, Netflix, HBO, I refuse to call it Max, and countless other companies have put on their best skipper masks to gaslight their audience for the sake of convenient tax write-offs. Now how am I going to watch Willow? It's actually more cost-effective to take the $90 million loss and write off a Batgirl film that was literally in post-production than to attempt to market and release it and then deal with the ramifications if it bombs. In the case of Flora and Ulysses, which was actually a finished project and available for 2+ years, Disney acquired Hulu in late 2023 and purged Flora and Ulysses from the Disney Disney Plus service alongside countless other examples. Luckily, the backlash to this decision means you can, at least now, buy the film if you'd like to watch it. However, at least in the UK, this Disney Plus original movie is no longer available to watch on Disney Plus. So we don't know how much they spent on it, and they tried to scrub it from history. This is absurd. But what about the movie itself? Give 100 squirrels 100 typewriters and you wind up with a cute, but forgettable, little movie that funnily has one of the strongest personalities out of everything in this list. This is a low-stakes family comedy about a superpowered squirrel that is vaguely a low-budget genre movie with some annoying Marvel and Star Wars references. Before I saw this, I assumed it had something to do with the Marvel characters Squirrel Girl, who I always considered almost Kite Man levels of stupid. Almost. Her squirrel companion is called Monkey Joe, and together they defeat Dr. Doom. That has nothing to do with this movie, but I thought you should know that. Sonic, American Pie, Abed, and a little girl who looks distractingly like the Good Doctor make up the cast of this movie. Given the material, they all do a good job. They seem to know the kind of movie they're in, but they're not half-assing it. There's an infectious energy that is appropriate for its target audience of babies, even with my joyless, jaded, hollow, husk-like perspective. This movie did get a few laughs out of me.
I'm better than Squirrel.
For movies like this, I usually apply a 30-minute rule just so I have an out if something is truly boring or unbearable. As I went to turn this off, Danny Pudi showed up, like an angel, to convince me that I should stick it through. My biggest issue with the production of this movie is that it looks like shit. They decided to light every location as if you're in a permanent flashback, entering into the pearly gates of heaven or ground zero for a nuclear blast. The washed out beams of light intrude nearly every scene in the movie. It's a weird choice. The juxtaposition of Disney references, recognizable actors, and expensive CG squirrels against these overly lit sound stages and cheap looking comic book montages makes me wish I knew the production budget. If Home Sweet Home Alone could get an estimated 15 million, who knows what they embezzled into this one. The saddest part about this project is that it's based on a cute children's book of the same name, full of charming illustrations and character designs. It seems unfortunately clear that the only way this was made was to shoehorn in Disney-owned IP superhero imagery and references to Star Wars, in order to capitalize on a trend and attempt to ensure children continue to like these brands. Hey Disney! You know, the leader of the animation industry. If you didn't hate animation so much these days, this could have been a real neat animated movie. You know, the thing you pioneered and built a brand on. The film opens on a comic book montage referencing the Silver Surfer and Wolverine, with details like the doorbell to the main character's house being a pointless Star Wars reference,
Flora!
Or a Trench Run reference, or an Avengers reference.
Love you 3000.
I'm sure that's in the book. Despite my many problems, it's hilarious that a quaint little movie about a superhero squirrel helping a little girl deal with her parents' relationship issues has more heart and character than many of these pre-established mega blockbusters who can make 3-hour-long films without a single likable character to be found. The smaller scale of this is nice and refreshing in contrast to the others. In the 2017 superhero list that I made, I talked about a bizarre Russian film simply called Guardians. I don't remember much about it outside there being a werebear and it being so ridiculous that it hardly qualified as a real movie. Major Grom, Plague Doctor, in contrast, is actually a watchable movie, but more importantly, is clearly the Russian answer to a Marvel movie. This was interesting to me in the same way the legendary RRR was interesting to me. How does a different culture present recognizable ideas, tropes, and stories, but lean on details and societal differences to bring a fresh energy that might be entertaining in an unexpected way compared to what we're used to in our own bubble? Major Grom is a real Russian comic that ran from 2012 to 2016 that provided the foundation for what this movie is based on. Major Grom translates to Major Thunder, as in a police major who is thunderous. So imagine a kind of similar story like Judge Dredd, who is a law enforcement officer who resides in the impressive nightmare known as Mega City 1. Now, imagine removing the satirical framing that points a finger at police brutality and authoritarianism, and remove the future dystopia and change the setting to contemporary St. Petersburg, and have the moral of the story to be a broad call to protect the status quo so the Russian powers and oligarchs can forever bleed you dry. Oh, and the insane serial killer Jesse Eisenberg Lex Luthor lead antagonist is obviously driven by his misplaced belief that freedom of expression is a fundamental human right. What a mad idea. Wow, I suppose when you give people freedom, that always creates flamethrower-wielding billionaire serial killers that otherwise wouldn't exist, so That means freedom of expression is dangerous, everybody. Obvious propaganda aside, there was actually plenty of surprising, fun visual flair and directional choices that indicate a passion for filmmaking at its core. You could enjoy this on a surface level as a fairly familiar action cop drama with Hollywood superhero tropes. It is having a lot of fun with itself. The tone balances the corny melodrama with fun characters who have expressive dynamics despite the obvious sources they're pulling from. Christopher Nolan's Batman films seem to be the biggest inspiration here, with the focus on institutionalized corruption and trying to explore the thin line between justice, vigilantism, and evil. It even builds to a citywide riot a la The Dark Knight Rises. Except here it actually makes a lot more sense. Intentional or not, the scariest villain in the movie is actually the investigator who is sent from Moscow to solve the Plague Doctor serial killer case, who does illustrate a good example of crookedness within an already established system, indicating the story was at least interested in depicting both sides, with elements of corruption despite the debatable conclusions that are reached. Major Grom, despite his obvious leading man, hyper-masculine lone wolf familiarness, is a fun lead character thanks to a charming performance and energetic camera work that keeps the story moving and vibrant. You're treated to comedic montages that help stop it from getting too self-serious. And there are some unusual creative choices that allow this to stand out in this genre. Major Grom isn't a superhero per se, but he might as well be. Many scenes in the movie are dedicated to his laser-fast problem solving, visually showing us the various different ways an encounter might play out if he doesn't think it through thoroughly, which culminates in a hilarious scene where he runs 3 different scenarios through his head, each one where something bad happens and a friend dies, and concludes that it's best to stop thinking and just picks up the Plague Doctor and runs out of a window with him. If we're comparing this to Marvel, it's still never on the same ridiculous scale you'll find in those movies, but there certainly is a lot more personality to the way this is put together. The restrictions of the lower budget make simple action scenes that involve things like car crashes hit much harder because it's not a mess of weightless CG goo on an obvious soundstage. And for only around $7 million US, you could make like 24 Groms for only one Thor: The Dark World. I can't remember a single shot from that movie. The plot is extremely simple and all been done before, the most egregious and eye-rolling example being how they handle the Plague Doctor villain. It's established early on that Russian Lex Luthor Jesse Eisenberg has created a social media platform which the Plague Doctor uses to spread anarchy and implant the idea that billionaires, megacorps, and institutionalized power is corrupt and needs dealing with for the greater good of the people. The Plague Doctor is presented as a mystery. Who is under the mask? Well, anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together would assume that Russian Lex Luthor Jesse Eisenberg is behind it all. However, the film tricks its audience in a way that is impossible to predict, pulling out the dual personality twist to explain that this was all inside Russian Lex Luthor Jesse Eisenberg's head this entire time. This lame twist combined with how comically evil they have to make him to make his ideas seem ridiculous, which is frustrating when in the same film there are young characters who are radicalized by violence in a surprisingly honest and realistic manner, indicating that there is some greater understanding buried within this. It reaches peak goofiness when a pre-established gang of drug dealers and crooks take to the streets to fight back the Plague Doctor revolution in a setup so stupid, it undoes a lot of the complexity of the power struggles it's trying to explore beforehand. While a likable personality and sense of humor can't overpower the corniness and familiarness, this wound up being a genuine surprise compared to a lot of expected shite that appears on this list. The way the story wraps up does itself a disservice, but this isn't particularly surprising considering where it comes from. You never find the level of complexity that is found in the movies that inspired it, with The Dark Knight playing around with similar ideas around technology and sacrificing privacy for security against terrorism, but the difference is there aren't sweeping conclusions that eliminate the complexity of the conundrum, and the audience is at least given a little bit of credit to reach their own conclusions without being told what they're supposed to think. Although it does make you wonder why elements of Hollywood films stand out as propaganda to other cultures. Although positioned almost as badly as Black Widow, Shang-Chi tries hard to make the best out of a bad situation. 25 films deep based on a character hardly anyone knows, following up the crescendo of Endgame, and competing with 3 other Marvel movies in the same year, as well as all the other ones. I was pleasantly surprised by elements of this movie that reminded me of the light-hearted fun from Phase 1, where we're being introduced to some of these characters for the first time, as well as reinvigorating some of the more frustrating elements of the MCU formula. As far as origin stories go, they do a pretty good job trickling out information and justifying why Shang-Chi can have elaborate Jackie Chan fight sequences 20 minutes into the movie. It's not interested in lingering in the slow build-up of a new hero finding his powers and figuring out how a MacGuffin works, but instead uses cleverly placed exposition scenes that expand the family dynamics and keep elements of mystery until the suitably dramatic time to reveal them. I mentioned that this is the 25th film in this franchise, and it goes to show just how bad and forgettable the majority of villains are when you can hardly name 5, and even then one is debatable and one is lifted from a different franchise of films. The point is, immediately, Tony Leung's inclusion elevates the stakes of the story, and the family dynamic of the characters makes this conflict so much more relatable and exciting. You'd probably be messed up too if your father was effectively an eternal god who trained you to be an assassin when you were a child because of some dingle rings he found 1,000 years ago. And speaking of, the whole rings MacGuffin was a lot cooler than I was anticipating, lending itself to some kinetic action that was fun to watch. I am fairly certain that every shot with the rings has them as entirely CGI, which is disappointing. You couldn't make 10 prop rings for scenes where there isn't crazy action happening? Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should, especially in a film that struggles with the expected Marvel synthetic sheen. More grounding elements are needed in the sea of dodgy effects and egregious soundstage usage that is not believable for a second, and might as well be a cartoon at points. The smaller scale hand-to-hand action though, in general, is pretty fantastic and addresses a lot of the weightless slop that poisons the average superhero movie. With Bill Pope behind the camera, cinematographer for excellent action films like The Matrix, Spider-Man 2 and Baby Driver, combined with the efforts of fight choreographer Xiang Gao and fight coordinator Peng Zhang, you're left with creative action set pieces that have great timing and spectacle to them. The action is shot wide and clear, as a lot of these actors are great at stunt work, so it doesn't need to be edited to obscure them. Unfortunately though, this movie is still bogged down by the Marvel curse. Well, many Marvel curses. As thrilling as the fisticuff action set pieces are, they do peak early on and utterly lose steam and focus towards the latter half of the runtime. Almost at the exact hour mark, the film nosedives in quality and becomes a mess of clunky exposition about the Keepers of the Dark Gate, the Soul Eaters, Red Armies versus Blue Armies, big CG dragons, and eventually becomes the typical mess of CG characters crashing and thrashing into each other in the exact same way these films have done since the very beginning. The character-driven action is cast aside for epic-scale dragon and monster fights that have virtually no build-up or intrigue. Your investment is in the family dynamics at this point, particularly with Shang and his dad, in which his motivation is offloaded onto a CG dragon that eats his soul and robs the character of resolution or drama, or potential for stories in the future. It would have been much more interesting to keep this character alive and have him live with the consequences of being tricked by a demon, but I doubt Tony Leung wanted to be attached at the hip for a decade for the sake of this franchise. Perhaps if this hidden world didn't look so unbelievably fake, it would be less distracting, but it's stretched to its limits when Pokemon starts showing up and it's trying to balance the typical light-hearted Marvel tone with the high stakes with what's going on with this family. Even at the best of times, the Marvel style of humor can be a bit much, and the comedy here is definitely not my cup of tea. Like, do you want to be a screwball comedy, or do you want me to care about the stakes? You should probably pick a lane and stick to it if you're not very good at balancing both. There are a couple of good gags with Ben Kingsley randomly returning as the disgraced Liverpudlian actor from Iron Man 3, but with so many characters in the mix, I don't know why he was needed to tag along for the entire last act of the movie. There's a point in the climax where it cuts to a reaction shot of him and you're like, oh yeah, he's here, I guess. I don't know what kind of dirt Awkwafina has on Hollywood producers that allow her to be in everything now, but she has a considerable role as the best friend character. It's kind of neat to see a platonic lead dynamic without feeling the need to make her a love interest, but it's still Awkwafina. She's actually an incredibly important character for the structure of the film to come together, with her being the audience stand-in who needs explaining as to what on earth is going on, but again, it's still Awkwafina. And I can't see her as anything except Awkwafina, even admittedly with how well she does fit into the tired Marvel style of humor. With how overly lit, overly produced, and overly familiar so much of this is, it's a shame most of the positives are matched with an equal negative. This is probably the closest Marvel has come since Endgame in capturing the initial spark that made these films alluring to begin with, and unlike some of these new characters, I could see a future for Shang-Chi and his family. The capper to this John Hughes-inspired, John Watts-directed trilogy of MCU Spider-Man movies is probably the best of the three, but also frustratingly holds a similar set of problems they've all suffered from, as well as introducing a new set of nitpicks that I personally can't get over. Building nostalgia, member-berry fanboy story beats into the plot is a huge risk. As much of a fan as I am of the original Raimi movies, let's not beat around the bush in admitting that the biggest draw of this movie was the multiverse reunion of the various different eras of Spider-Man and their corresponding villains all smashed together into one timeline. The standouts being Alfred Molina as Doc Ock, Willem Dafoe as the Green Goblin, and most surprising to me, an effective return of Andrew Garfield to provide a bit of a conclusion to a character that was awkwardly abandoned after the utterly embarrassing Amazing Spider-Man 2, which, speaking of, is part of where the problem with this nostalgia hook brings the project down. The two Amazing Spider-Man movies are bad movies. Not to say there aren't some okay aspects to them here and there, but overall they are not good, especially that second one. So for two of the villains from those movies, the weird Joker lizard and Jamie Foxx's Electro, to make a return is an ugly, constant reminder of how bad those movies are. They do what they can with these characters to uncringe their presence, completely redesigning Electro specifically to be far more likable as a villain, and mostly restricting the lizard to a background monster hidden in the shadows, but the point still stands. John Watts is a fairly plain director to me. There's nothing about his style that screams out to me as very unique or able to penetrate the grubby Marvel overlord fingers from grey gooing the personality that could make the movie stand out on its own. There's an overbearing synthetic fakeness, an egregious overuse of green screen, and especially including Raimi characters, is a stark reminder of how much more wild and creative the production of those early 2000s films were. It often feels like actors aren't in the same room, probably because they weren't, operating in a vacuum. These movies are so calculated and meticulously planned to such a degree that there isn't much room for life to be found in the imperfect space in between. Perhaps this is more of an overall Marvel fatigue on my behalf, but honestly, I really don't feel like I'm alone with how these movies are blending into each other. So much of the action is like watching an expensive cartoon that expects you to believe there's a live action element keeping it grounded, when I'm often left just wishing that these movies were fully animated to begin with. We are 90% there at this point anyway. Not to say that Spider-Verse took the punch away from the concept and execution of this movie, but Spider-Verse took the punch away and the concept and execution of this movie, and is all around a far superior movie from every possible angle. The multiverse concept is so shallow here compared to something like Spider-Verse, where it was used to bring out and contrast characters, to thematically link everything together and create new yet familiar dynamics and angles that all feed into this central hero's journey of Miles, culminating with his leap of faith into being a fully fledged superhero. Here, it's Tom Holland's 6th appearance as this character, so finding an interesting arc is already more of an innate challenge, and with so much of the runtime being dedicated to this team-up, his character somewhat falls to the wayside. His biggest hurdle is the spell he convinces Doctor Strange to weave in order for everyone to forget his true identity, revealed at the end of Far From Home. In fact, the best action scene in the movie is the sequence between Strange and Peter, where the animation team are able to take the reins and carry a creative and fun exchange. But in a weird way, we are so past the point of no return with these interlocked, pardon the pun, webs of movies, all with references, setups, and exposition spread out over different eras of movies. It's more like episodes of a TV show, but I'm finding it increasingly difficult to care with all these ongoing issues they have. With James Gunn already proving that his stylings work well with obscure ragtag comic book team-ups, it's no surprise that The Suicide Squad is one of the few genuinely good superhero movies of 2021. Gunn knows how to juggle the right balance between the absurd comedy and superhero spectacle without destroying the sense of tension, and having likable characters who are developed just enough to avoid the numerous pitfalls the horrendous 2016 version fell into. Instead of trying to distance themselves from the stain the 2016 version left behind, Gunn instead decided to lean more into its potential. He's at his best when he's allowed as much freedom as possible to call Polka Dot Man a pussy, eviscerate Captain Boomerang in helicopter blades, or show a shark man chow down on live humans in excruciating detail. Where was this stuff in Venom? All while framing the story as a not-so-subtle commentary on American military overreach, and playing true to the original concept of the Suicide Squad being a collection of expendable B-tier supervillains. Great casting even utilizes the likes of John Cena and Pete Davidson to full comedic effect. A sentence I thought I would never say. It's so refreshing for one of these superhero movies to have cartoonish violence and comedy without leaning into the tired Marvel snark style of dialogue.
Watch your language.
Or Deadpool's blunt self-awareness, but not entirely sacrificing the tone for absurdist comedy. There are still stakes and consequences to the story. The hilariously violent opening montage sets the stage perfectly, with the creative touches like the diegetic title cards and imaginative imagery that each character brings to the table. To embrace this concept, Harley Quinn aside, without fully relying on the cheat code of featuring fan-favorite characters like Batman or the Joker, is refreshing. Pulling out deep cuts like Polka Dot Man, Peacemaker, Arm Fall Off Boy, a lot of the jokes write themselves. To playfully mock the more obscure history of DC while also creating a story with consistent humor, action, and tension was quite a feat. I couldn't really ask for more from a Suicide Squad movie. The accompanying Peacemaker show is also decent, very reminiscent of Gunn's early parody superhero work like Super. It even references Kite Man. Gunn has proven that he's good enough as a writer and director to work within the bounds of Marvel, DC, and exploitation trauma parody. I just hope his shot at a Superman movie comes together and gives the character the representation he deserves. I feel like we need Superman right now. Okay, so next up will be the trying to watch for Thunderforce, which is live now for members or will be made public in a week from now for everybody else. After that, I'm gonna get my Destiny 2 Final Shape video out. I've already started work on that one. Followed then by the superhero movie 2022 and 2023 videos. That'll keep me nice and busy. Huge shout out to my new editor, Joe, who helped me with some of the segments of this video. The full details can be found in the description of what he did and where to find him. Check out my soft-launched IGTV channel, a second channel where I put easier to make, less polished videos. And finally, for even more of me, you can find me on Jar Media every week and Sardonicast with Your Movie Sucks every other week. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.